Hi, folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about and using as a launching pad for this, the early 1930s novel of British writer Aldous Huxley called Brave New World. Now, just for those who haven't read, or just a quick refresher, I'll simplify this. Brave New World talked about a society where people were genetically bred for the roles that they would have in society. So the brightest people were bred at the top to sort of manage everything. Then you get the next layer and next layer until you got, the alphas at the top, and then the epsilon class at the bottom to just do the basic grunt work, clean the toilet, sweep the streets, and so on. So, but this was depicted as in an advanced technology society. Babies were born in test tubes, that sort of thing. This was viewed as being, whilst dystopian on one hand, it was incredibly efficient, it was delivering much bounty to the society. You only had people that were truly capable of the tasks they were allocated. So the brain surgeon was the most expert brain surgeon around, and the engineer was the most expert engineer, and so on. Then this was, again, predetermined genetically, and people were bred for the roles that they would fill in society. Now, there was sort of a narrative that went over the top of this, and certainly some people have been looking at it since. And bearing in mind, this was conceived in the late 1920s, around the time of the Wall Street crash. So in 1929, and it was published, I think, in 1932, somewhere around there. So during the time of the Great Depression, so that backdrop and the long shadow of the First World War sort of fed into the perceptions of the time and the day, and so it is to some degree a product of its times. Brave New World. Nonetheless, there was another sort of overarching narrative, if you like, within the novel, and the ideas and theories that the novel was putting forward, which were quite in your face really at the time. And that is that if you mismatch the person and their capabilities with the task, then you get a very negative outcome. So if someone who is the worst brain surgeon in the world is given the job of doing brain surgery, then it's not going to end well. So the idea is to try and get the closest match with the capability in the task, and thus you will have a society that's the closest to, at least in productive outcomes and quality of outcomes, is the closest to the utopia you'll get. Now, will it be a moral utopia of everybody's equal, and that the street sweeper can be the brain surgeon, all that sort of stuff? Well, no, not in that sense. And also raises the issue of what is moral equality, what is equality before God. We're all God's creatures. That's an equality before the law, equality of outcome. Why has that guy got a waterfront mansion and I don't? And those sorts of things. Why is this person extremely good looking and I'm not? And all those sorts of other questions. But the novel sort of made if you like, a point, a little bit abstract. But if you give people the job that they're not capable of doing, so if you assign a simple person a complex task, they won't be able to do it, and they'll be but if you keep the system of measurement in place, did you or did you not perform and discharge that task? Did you attempt the brain surgery and you cut the dude's head off instead of doing the brain? This sort of things that the people who are incapable will become frustrated, exasperated. They'll become angry. Why are you indirectly humiliating me, making me look bad by giving me a job that I can't do? I can't do this job. Now, the same can be said, if you look at it from a genetic perspective. There's a wide range of genetic capabilities which are probably genetic, or at least to some extent or a large extent are. There's a kid at school, for example, who he could look at what I thought was quite a complicated calculus simultaneous equation, and this is in advanced mathematics class in high school. And he didn't even have to get out a piece of paper and crunch the numbers. He could just look at it and come up with, yep, the value is X, value is this value. And he could just look at it by doing it. I couldn't do that. I couldn't even begin to imagine how he could do that. But he just had the brain power and the type of brain power, the structure of brain power. Whereas if you said to him, go and write a poem, he'd be lost. So there are horses for courses, as they say. But again, the secondary narrative, as I see it in the novel, is why give complex tasks to people who can't do them? Why don't you match the capacity and the capability of the individual with the complexity of the task? Now, that may involve training, but there are people who you can train and they're never going to get it. And there are people, for example, you can try and train people to be able to do those calculus equations just in their head, just by looking at them without putting pen to paper at all. And you could try for years trying to get some people to do that and just never get it. And I remember, again, I'm using high school as the first example. When I first saw this, is that there were kids that just weren't getting certain tasks, topics, subjects. And back in the day, the teachers would say, look, you're wasting your time beating yourself up over trying to do mathematics. You're just never going to get it. You can't even add 1 and 1, and just forget that. Go and do something else. The reverse was also the case, certainly as a younger kid, even in elementary or primary school. The teachers back in the day I don't think they do it now. Teachers back in the day would try and find where you had some sort of natural ability and then try and encourage that and try and get you to develop that natural ability, because it's much more likely that training and education and so on in that area where you have that natural ability is much more likely to produce a positive outcome than trying to beat yourself up over doing something you're not capable of. So Aldous Huxley said, well, the most effective society is, and this is where you're getting the best medical care, you're getting the best food quality, you're getting the best financial, every outcome is the best, because the very best, the most capable people in that area are delivering those services because they're the most capable and the most trainable in that area of learning, medicine, for example. So, but coming around again, the moral question is well, that's not equal outcomes. Now, and Aldous Huxley was suggesting that it could be done given the setting of the novel, through advanced technology, genetic engineering of humans in test tubes and so on. But the reality is that there was a form, not perfect, far from it, but there was a form of that going on anyway. If you have a merit-based system where only the brightest kids are passing the maths test or the whatever test, and you've had absolutely impartial examination, everyone has access to the same education, that's important. That should be equal. Everybody gets to go to school. That should be something that in a society should be, an advanced society, I think, should be universal. But will the outcomes be the same? Well, no, of course they won't. Some kids are going to be good at this, but not at that. And some are more capable at this. Some are more studious. Some are more diligent. Some are harder working, all that sort of thing. Some have parents who are more supportive. There were, and even that's a wild card. There were parents who, certainly I remember parents that were very, very supportive of their children. Educate anything the child needed. You need a desk done. You need a light so you can, desk light so you can better sit done. What books do you need done? And they would do that. But that didn't necessarily, you'd get a better outcome than I think if you didn't do that. But it didn't necessarily translate into kids doing well at school. They would maybe do okay, but relative to the effort the parents were putting in, the results were actually quite ordinary. Similarly, kids who didn't have that sort of support but were diligent and conscientious and hardworking would go to the local community library and have to access the books and the reference materials there. But because of their eagerness and determination and energy they applied in hitting the books, they got a more productive outcome, even though they had less parental support. So there's some wildcard elements in those sort of things. But coming back to Aldous Huxley, This concept of why allocate complex tasks to people who can't do them. They'll only become angry and frustrated and irritated and have a sense of that they've somehow been diminished. Why do you give me this difficult task to do when you know I can't do it? You're only going to make me feel bad or make me look bad, or that type of thing. So Huxley doesn't say this directly, but posits, if you like, the overall architecture of the thought that, okay, well, we don't want to have you frustrated. We've given you a task you can't do because you're too fucking dumb or lazy or all of the above. But what instead of you having you feel bad by not being able to do this complex task that we shouldn't have really allocated to you in the first place, but we did it because we wanted a system of social equity, equal outcomes. So we gave you the complex task because people that do the complex task typically are they're respected members of the society. It's a prestigious role, and we wanted you to have that, the respect and the prestige, without being concerned about your capability. So I know what we'll do. Rather than have you fail at doing this task that you're never capable of doing, we'll just lower the requirements. So we'll say that actually you don't really need to know what you're doing. We'll just give you that title and position and prestige anyway. We'll give you the PhD as a gift. And the matter of just giving you the PhD, there is the equality. But can you do the job equally as well as a capable person? Well, no, you can't. But we'll just obscure that by lowering the standards, and we'll just lower the requirements. We won't judge you. We won't measure you. We won't apply any independent, impartial test or grading system. And in that way, you're not embarrassed by your inability or lack of capability. Now, that would mean that the most capable person isn't being allocated to those jobs, or isn't being rewarded to any extent greater than the least capable person. But at least you have social equality. So Huxley was really raising those issues then. Now, how did it come about? Why was Huxley even thinking about that? Well, he was sort of moving and grooving with the British upper class. And these views of in the day of the upper class, things were changing. The Labor government, the party of the workers had come to power in the federal elections in Britain, and this was causing much discussion and much of where are things heading, where are they going, and whereas the hereditary end of the scale, which would be the aristocratic system, which by and large, for whatever failings it had, and it certainly had the failings, the British ruling class, they were only a few thousand people, but they took Britain from being an irrelevant island off the coast of Europe into being the world's #1 power. So don't sell these people short. Did they have failings? Did they make mistakes? You bet. But remember, just a few thousand people were directing all the energies, all the resources and so on of the English state, the British state, and turned it into the world's #1 superpower. So again, don't sell them short. They were, by and large, pretty good, failings notwithstanding. So the British system, they believed at the time that effectively the hereditary system was pretty good. And by and large, it was the better, the smarter, brighter, more capable people who were in charge. But what if you moved away from that? How could the aristocrats stay in charge? Could it be through selective breeding? And the aristocrats in Britain fancy themselves pretty much as being in the selective breeding end of the scale. You would marry and procreate with someone who was of the correct social and intellectual standing. So there was already a sense of that selective breeding being, in effect, what Huxley was talking about with his children in test tubes and so on. Now, in addition to that, the theories of Marx were very much going around the British upper class at the time, and around, well, not just the British upper class, around generally in the coffee shops and the so-called intellectual hothouses of Western Europe, where, would it be possible to have an equal society where everyone was equal? And there's always a sort of a gravitational pull those sort of thoughts have. And in the abstract, it sounds wonderful. Very, very different when you try and apply it to the practical reality on the street. But nonetheless, as a theory to discuss and for intellectuals to theorize on, then Marxism was certainly around at the time. And this fed into Huxley. Now, also, Huxley was hanging around with a lot of British aristocrats who'd been part of the British in India, where the caste system in India, the Brahmin class, the keepers of the knowledge, and the untouchable class at the bottom, which mirrored the classes to a large extent, not perfectly, mirrored the classes to a large extent that Huxley was referring to in Brave New World. And in effect, the Indians had separated breeding grounds for each, so that the untouchables would only breed with each other, the Brahmins would only breed with each other, and so on. So that it was already, if you like, a de facto test tube environment in India in the caste system. Now, the reincarnation side of the Indian sort of mysticism isn't so. Huxley did look at that later, but wasn't really referred to in Brave New World. Now, the other factor that fed into Huxley's thinking was his observation of the United States. And this was very much sort of after the First World War and in the 1920s, where the Americans were engaging in mass production and specialization within mass production. Now, this was something fairly new in the world. You were seeing it, coming into certainly, in the, say, the days of Henry Ford, for example. So you were seeing that there. And also the Germans were looking at that. But really, those were the only two places in the world, Germany and the United States, where you really saw that being applied in some widespread sense. So the mass production and the efficiency of specialization of labor, and which of course produced greater productivity. So instead of the carriage maker making the car carriage and then the motor wheel being put into it, which was more or less how things were done in the earlier days, Henry Ford had this idea of the raw materials came in the back door, the finished car came out the front door, and then in between was all the specialization of labor and production lines and so on. So this was something that again was the talk of the aristocratic elite in Britain and elsewhere. And they weren't doing that sort of thing in Britain. It was still a cottage industry to a large extent. All manufacturing was still sort of smallish factories here and there building this and making that. And you could have the same company, exact same business, theoretically with the same design of product, but the product made in the factory in the north of England was not the same as the factory made in the south of England. Maybe there wasn't a huge difference, but there was enough difference where parts and things like that were not interchangeable, whereas they were in the United States. And this was something Huxley latched on to in conceptual sense, at least, where if you have this specialization of labor, where you have the grunt workers putting on the bolt at the bottom, then you have the supervisor, then the sort of department manager, and then the chief executive, all that sort of stuff. So this idea that people were allocated tasks based on their capability, he used, was certainly influenced by America and the USA and that framework there. But it comes back today, where that sort of idea of people are allocated based on their capability has completely fallen to pieces in the Western world. And we see it in every sense all around us, where people that are simply not capable of the job, they neither have the brain power or the education. Now, the brain power means they just haven't got it anyway. And then B, the education, where everyone's been given a participation trophy education right through from junior high school into university and up to and including a PhD. So you've got a lot of people running around with PhDs that don't know what day it is, but they're being allocated jobs and tasks and functions that are meant for people who do have that capability. And so there's a complete mismatch now between the task to be performed and the capability of the individual being put into that job role. And this was something I think Huxley was touching on. So we can have if we follow Huxley's thinking, we can have a highly efficient society with great bounty being delivered and great efficiency and the very best medical care and this, that, and the next thing, or the very best education. Or we can have a situation where the tasks and the people and the allocation, there's such a massive mismatch that we have the opposite of a utopia, we have some sort of abstract miasma of a moral utopia, but the complete opposite of an efficiency utopia. And is this of any benefit to any society? Ultimately, and many would argue not. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.